There is something very interesting happening beneath the surface of Lioness Season 3, Episode 5. At first glance, the story appears to be about finding Joe, but I think the bigger story is actually about who Caitlyn is willing to use to get to Joe, and why Kyle may be more important to this operation than we realize. Because if you look closely at everything that has happened since Joe's situation began spiraling out of control, one thing has become increasingly obvious. This is no longer a normal extraction mission. Joe is not simply another operative who needs to be brought home. She has become a potential liability, a source of intelligence, and possibly even a target that someone inside the system wants eliminated. And that is exactly why Kyle could become the most important piece on the board. So today, we're going deep into the theory that Caitlyn may use Kyle to locate, manipulate, or ultimately rescue Joe. And there is one hidden clue that could completely change how we interpret Episode 5. Let's break it down. The first thing we need to understand is Caitlyn's position. Caitlyn cannot simply send a team into enemy territory and say, "Bring Joe home." That would be far too simple for the situation we've been watching unfold. The Season 3 storyline has already established that hidden networks and foreign operatives are operating around the CIA, while Joe's own operation has become increasingly compromised. And the official synopsis for Episode 5 is particularly interesting, because it says Joe is leading the hunt, while Caitlyn and Byron are working to assess the larger threat. That wording matters, because it suggests there are two separate battles happening at the same time. Joe is dealing with the immediate danger. Caitlyn is dealing with the bigger intelligence problem, and when Caitlyn is dealing with an intelligence problem, she rarely solves it with brute force. She looks for leverage. That is where Kyle comes in. Kyle isn't Joe, and that's precisely why he could be useful. Joe operates like a field commander. She understands the battlefield instinctively. She knows how to improvise, how to survive, and how to make impossible decisions when everything collapses around her. Kyle, however, occupies a different position. He can operate in places where Joe's presence would immediately raise alarms. And more importantly, Kyle may have access to information, contacts, or operational knowledge that could help Caitlyn reconstruct what happened to Joe. The official Episode 5 images specifically show Kyle interrogating someone. That is not a random detail. Think about what an interrogation means in a storyline like this. It means the CIA doesn't just need firepower, they need information. Someone knows where the network is. Someone knows who is moving people. Someone knows who is coordinating the operation. And Kyle could be one of the people tasked with pulling that information out. But here's where the theory becomes much more interesting. What if Kyle isn't being used to find Joe directly? What if Caitlyn is using Kyle to find the people who know where Joe is? That's a completely different strategy. Instead of chasing Joe, they chase the network around Joe. And that could be much more effective. Now, let's talk about the clue. Kyle being shown in an interrogation scene could simply mean he's gathering intelligence, but I think there's another possibility. What if the person Kyle is interrogating is connected to the same hidden network that compromised Joe's operation? Remember, Season 3 has repeatedly emphasized patterns, missing names, hidden relationships, and intelligence operations that don't initially make sense. The official Season 3 description itself talks about hidden networks, foreign operatives, and betrayals colliding around Joe. That means the writers are deliberately encouraging us to look beyond individual villains. The real enemy may be a network, and if Kyle manages to break one person inside that network, Caitlyn could potentially trace the chain upward. Person number 1 gives Kyle a name. That name leads to another contact. That contact reveals another location. And eventually, Joe. This would also explain why Kyle's role could become much more important in Episode 5. He's not necessarily the person who physically rescues Joe. He may be the person who makes the rescue possible. Here's another theory I think deserves serious attention. Caitlyn may not know exactly who she can trust. And that changes everything. We've already watched this season build an atmosphere where intelligence agencies, foreign operatives, and covert handlers are overlapping. When you don't know where the leak is, you cannot simply tell everyone what you're planning, because the moment the wrong person receives the information, Joe's location could be compromised again. So Caitlyn may need someone who can operate quietly, someone who can investigate without revealing the entire objective. And Kyle could fit that role perfectly. This is why I don't think the phrase, Caitlyn uses Kyle, necessarily means she orders him into a direct rescue mission. It could mean something much more strategic. She could give Kyle only part of the picture. He investigates one person, another team follows another lead, Caitlyn watches the connections, and slowly, they reconstruct the entire operation without giving the enemy enough information to realize they're closing in. That's classic intelligence tradecraft, and it would fit the direction Season 3 appears to be taking. But here's where things get even more interesting. What if Kyle already knows something about Joe's situation that Caitlyn doesn't? Think about the position Kyle has occupied throughout this storyline. He's close enough to the operation to understand the danger, but he isn't necessarily sitting at the center of every decision. That makes him an interesting character to use as an information bridge. He could hear something from the field, he could discover something during an interrogation, or he could identify a connection that the senior officials have completely missed. And that could create one of the most interesting dynamics in Episode 5. Caitlyn has the authority. Kyle has the access. Joe has the experience. Put those three things together, and you have a potentially powerful rescue strategy. But there is one problem. The enemy may already know that they're looking. This is where I think Episode 5 could become extremely dangerous. Imagine Caitlyn finally gets a location connected to Joe. Everything lines up. The intelligence looks legitimate. The team prepares to move. Kyle is involved. And then they discover that the information was deliberately planted. That's the nightmare scenario. Because if the people holding Joe realize the CIA is searching for her, they could feed the agency exactly what they want to hear. A fake location, a fake contact, a fake extraction opportunity. And suddenly the rescuers become the ones walking into the trap. This would fit the title of the episode, The Idiot Army, in a very interesting way. Because perhaps the title isn't only referring to the enemy, maybe it's questioning whether intelligence agencies are being manipulated into doing exactly what their opponents want. The official Episode 5 material confirms that the larger network is becoming a major focus of the story. So the real danger may not be finding Joe. It may be knowing whether the path leading to Joe is real. Another major clue comes from the fact that Caitlyn and Byron are both heavily involved in Episode 5. We know official images place them together, and another image brings Caitlyn, Byron, Joe, and Secretary of State Edwin Mullins into the same frame. That is a massive concentration of power, and whenever Lioness puts these characters together, it usually means the situation has moved beyond a simple field operation. It has become political. That matters for Joe. Because if Joe's situation has reached the highest levels of the intelligence structure, then rescuing her may no longer be just about saving one operative. It could be about preventing something much larger from becoming public. And Caitlyn may be under pressure to solve the problem quietly. That could be another reason Kyle becomes useful. He can operate below the political spotlight. Caitlyn can coordinate from above. And Joe remains the objective. But here's my biggest theory. What if Kyle's role isn't simply to rescue Joe? What if he becomes the person who discovers who betrayed her? That's potentially much bigger. Because rescuing Joe solves the immediate problem. Finding the person responsible solves the larger problem. And Season 3 has been building toward exactly that kind of revelation. If Kyle discovers that the same network responsible for Joe's predicament has connections inside the American intelligence structure, then the entire mission changes. Suddenly Caitlyn can't simply bring Joe home and move on. They would need to identify every compromised person, every handler, every contact, every piece of information that was leaked. And that could explain why Episode 5 appears to be expanding the story, rather than simply resolving the cliffhanger from Episode 4. The official synopsis says the team is exposing a hidden network operating through covert handlers. That wording strongly suggests Joe's situation is only one piece of something much larger. But we also have to consider the opposite possibility. Maybe Caitlyn doesn't actually rescue Joe. Maybe Caitlyn gives Kyle the information necessary to reach Joe, but by the time they arrive, Joe has already begun fighting her way out. And honestly, that would be very consistent with Joe's character. Joe is not someone who simply waits for rescue. Even when she's trapped, she's thinking. She's observing. She's calculating. She's looking for weaknesses. So while Caitlyn and Kyle could be working from the outside, Joe could be dismantling the operation from within. And if that happens, the rescue mission becomes something completely different. Instead of, find Joe, it becomes, find Joe before she destroys the entire operation. And that could lead to an incredible confrontation. Now let's bring all of this together. The biggest clue isn't necessarily Kyle himself. It's the fact that Kyle is being shown in an intelligence-gathering role, at the same time the story is expanding toward a hidden network. That suggests information may be the key to Joe's survival. Not guns, not soldiers, not political pressure. Information. Who knows what? Who is connected to whom? Who is lying? And who is deliberately feeding the CIA false information? Caitlyn understands this. That's why I think her smartest move could be using Kyle as the investigative link between the field and the intelligence operation. Kyle finds the information. Caitlyn connects the dots. Joe exploits the weakness. And together, they could turn the tables. But there's still one question I can't get out of my head. What happens if the person Caitlyn trusts to help rescue Joe is already compromised? Because if the hidden network has penetrated deeper than we think, Kyle himself could be walking into the operation without realizing it. And that would make the rescue mission far more dangerous than anyone expects. This is where I think Episode 5 could deliver its biggest twist. Caitlyn may deliberately use Kyle as bait, not because she doesn't value him, but because she needs to know who reacts when Kyle starts moving toward Joe. Think about it. If someone inside the system is protecting the people holding Joe, then any rescue operation should trigger a response. And that response could reveal the mole. Caitlyn could essentially create a controlled operation and watch who moves. Who makes a call? Who changes a schedule? Who suddenly disappears? Who warns the enemy? That's how you expose a hidden network. And if this theory is correct, then Kyle may not simply be helping Caitlyn rescue Joe. He could unknowingly be helping her expose the person who betrayed Joe in the first place. And that would completely change the meaning of Episode 5. Because Joe's rescue would no longer be the endgame. It would be the beginning of the purge. So here's the question I want you to think about. Do you believe Caitlyn is genuinely using Kyle to rescue Joe? Or is Kyle being used as bait to expose someone much closer to the CIA than we realize? Because if Caitlyn already suspects there is a mole inside the operation, then the person who appears to be helping Joe could actually be the person putting her in even greater danger. And here's the scary part. If Joe survives because Kyle finds her, but the person who leaked Joe's location is still inside the system, then Joe may return home only to discover that the enemy came home with her. That could be the real twist waiting for us in Episode 5. So tell me in the comments, is Kyle Caitlyn's secret weapon, or is he being used as bait to expose the mole? And if you think Caitlyn already knows who betrayed Joe, tell me who you think it is and why. If you enjoyed this theory, make sure you subscribe, because Lioness is clearly setting up something much bigger than a simple rescue mission. And if Episode 5 reveals that Kyle was never the rescuer, but the bait, then everything we've been watching could suddenly make sense.